As the empire founded by Muhammad had for its principle the spirit of conquest, as the state was not defended by any provident institution, and as all depended upon the personal character of the prince, it might easily be perceived that symptoms of decay began to appear as soon as there remained nothing else to conquer, and the chiefs ceased either to make themselves feared or to inspire respect. The caliphs of Baghdad, rendered effeminate by luxury and corrupted by long prosperity, abandoned the cares of empire, buried themselves in their seraglios, and appeared to reserve to themselves no other right than that of being named in the public prayers. The Arabians were no longer governed by that blind zeal and that ardent fanaticism which they had brought from the desert. Degenerated, like their chiefs, they no longer resembled their warlike ancestors, who would weep at not having been present at a battle. The authority of the caliphs had lost its true defenders, and when despotism surrounded itself with slaves purchased on the banks of the Oxus, this foreign militia, called in to defend the throne, only precipitated its fall. Now sectaries, seduced by the example of Muhammad, and persuaded that the world would obey those who should change its manners or opinions, added the danger of religious dissensions to that of political troubles. In the midst of the general confusion, the emirs, or lieutenants, of whom several governed vast kingdoms, no longer offered anything beyond a vain homage to the successor of the Prophet, and refused to send him either money or troops. The gigantic empire of the Abbasids crumbled away on all sides, and the world, according to the expression of an Arabian writer, was in the reach of him who would take possession of it. The spiritual power was itself divided. Islamism beheld at one time 5 caliphs, each of whom assumed the title of commander of the faithful and vicar of Muhammad. The numerous dynasties which sprung up amidst the troubles of Asia shared amongst them the spoils of the sovereigns of Baghdad. Those which ruled over Persia and upon the banks of the Tigris, under the pretense of defending the Mussulman religion, subjected their spiritual chiefs to the most humiliating subserviency. At the same time, the Fatimids, who pretended to be descended from Ali, and who had usurped the title of caliph, raised armies and launched anathemas against the Abbasids. They had taken possession of Egypt, and they threatened to invade Syria, and to march to Baghdad and dethrone the vicars of the Prophet. The Greeks, then, appeared to rouse themselves from their long supineness, and sought to take advantage of the divisions and the humiliation of the Saracens. Nikephoros Phocas took the field at the head of a powerful army and recaptured Antioch from the Mussulmans. Already the people of Constantinople celebrated his triumphs and styled him the Star of the East, the death and the scourge of the infidels. He might, perhaps, have merited these titles if the Greek clergy had seconded his efforts. Nikephoros was desirous of giving to this war a religious character, and to place in the rank of martyrs all who should fall in prosecuting it. The prelates of his empire condemned his design as sacrilegious, and opposed to him a canon of St. Basil, the text of which recommended to him who had killed an enemy to abstain during 3 years from a participation in the holy mysteries. Deprived of the powerful stimulus of fanaticism, Nikephoros found among the Greeks more panegyrists than soldiers, and could not pursue his advantages against the Saracens, to whom, even in their decline, religion prescribed resistance and promised victory. His triumphs, which were celebrated at Constantinople with enthusiasm, were confined to the taking of Antioch, and only served to create a persecution against the Christians of Palestine. The Patriarch of Jerusalem, accused of keeping up an understanding with the Greeks, expired at the stake, and several churches of the Holy City were consigned to the flames. A Greek army, under the command of Timalicus, had advanced to the gates of Amida, a city situated on the banks of the Tigris. This army was attacked, in the midst of a hurricane, by the Saracens, who routed it and made a great number of prisoners. The Christian soldiers who fell into the hands of the infidels heard, in the prisons of Baghdad, of the death of Nikephoros, and as Zimisces, his successor, gave no attention to their deliverance, their chief wrote to him in these terms: "You who leave us to perish in an accursed land, and who do not deem us worthy to be buried, according to Christian usages, in the tombs of our fathers, we cannot recognize you as a legitimate chief of the Holy Greek Empire. If you do not avenge those who fell before Amida, and those who now sigh in foreign lands, God will demand a strict account of them of you at the terrible day of judgment." When Zimisces received this letter at Constantinople, says an Armenian historian, he was penetrated with grief and resolved to avenge the outrage inflicted upon religion and the empire. On all sides, preparations were set on foot for a fresh war against the Saracens. The nations of the West were no strangers to this enterprise, which preceded, by more than a year, the first of the Crusades. Venice, which then enjoyed the commerce of the East, forbade her people, under pain of death, to convey to the Mussulmans of Africa and Asia either iron, wood, or any species of arms. The Christians of Syria and several Armenian princes repaired to the standard of Zimisces, who took the field and carried war into the territories of the Saracens. So great was the confusion which then prevailed among the Musulman powers, and with such rapidity did one dynasty succeed to another, that history can scarcely distinguish what prince or what people ruled over Palestine and Jerusalem. After having defeated the Musulmans on the banks of the Tigris, and forced the Caliph of Baghdad to pay a tribute to the successors of Constantine, Zimisces penetrated, almost without resistance, into Judea, took possession of Caesarea, of Ptolemais, of Tiberias, Nazareth, and several other cities of the Holy Land. He was encamped upon Tabor when he received a deputation of the inhabitants of Ramallah and Jerusalem, who promised him obedience and required of him troops to defend their cities. Zimisces received their submission and their request favorably, and pursued the wreck of the Saracen army, which had sought refuge in some cities of Phoenicia and in the mountains of Libanus. After this first campaign, the Holy Land appeared to be on the eve of being delivered entirely from the yoke of the infidels, when the emperor died poisoned. His death at once put a stop to the execution of an enterprise of which he was the soul and the leader. The Christian nations had scarcely time to rejoice at the delivery of Jerusalem, when they learnt that the holy city had again fallen into the hands of the Fatimid caliphates, who, after the death of Zimisces, had invaded Syria and Palestine. The caliphs of Cairo, who had taken advantage of the transient conquests of the Greeks to extend their empire, at first treated the Christians as allies and auxiliaries. In the hope of enriching their new dominions and repairing the evils of war, they favored the commerce of the Europeans and tolerated the devotion of pilgrimages to the Holy Land. The markets of the Franks were re-established in the city of Jerusalem. The Christians rebuilt the hospitals of the pilgrims and the churches which were falling to decay. They began to forget the peaceful domination of the Abbasids and felicitated themselves upon living under the laws of the sovereigns of Cairo. And still greater right had they to hope that all their troubles were about to be at an end when they saw the Caliph Hakim, whose mother was a Christian, ascend the throne. But God, who according to the expression of contemporary authors, wished to try the virtues of the faithful, did not long delay to confound their hopes and raise new persecutions against them. Hakim, the third of the Fatimid caliphs, signalized his reign by all the excesses of fanaticism and outrage. Unfixed in his own projects, and wavering between two religions, he by turns protected and persecuted Christianity. He respected neither the policy of his predecessors nor the laws which he himself had established. He changed, on the morrow, that which he had ordained the preceding day, and spread disorder and confusion throughout his dominions. In the extravagance of his mind, and the intoxication of power, he carried his madness so far as to believe himself a god. The terror which he inspired procured him worshippers, and altars were raised to him in the neighborhood of Fostat, which he had given up to the flames. 16,000 of his subjects prostrated themselves before him, and adored him as sovereign of the living and the dead. Hakim despised Muhammad, but the Musulmans were too numerous in his states to allow him to think of persecuting them. The god trembled for the authority of the prince, and allowed all his anger to fall upon the Christians, whom he gave up to the fury of their enemies. The places which the Christians held in the administration, and the abuses introduced into the mode of levying the imposts, with which duty they were charged, had drawn upon them the hatred of all the Musulmans. When the Caliph Hakim had once given the signal for persecution, he found himself at no loss for executioners. At first, they who had abused their power were the objects of pursuit. The Christian religion became the next crime, and the most pious among the faithful were deemed the most guilty. The blood of the Christians flowed in all the cities of Egypt and Syria, their courage in the midst of torments, only adding to the hatred of their persecutors. The complaints which escaped them in their sufferings, the prayers even, which they addressed to Jesus Christ to put an end to their evils, were considered as a revolt, and punished as the most guilty treasons. It is probable that motives of policy joined with those of fanaticism in the persecution of the Christians. Gerbert, Archbishop of Ravenna, who had become Pope, under the name of Sylvester II, had witnessed the ills to which the faithful were subjected in their pilgrimages to Jerusalem. On his return, he excited the nations of the West to take up arms against the Saracens. In his exhortations, he made Jerusalem herself speak, made her deplore her misfortunes, and conjure her Christian children to hasten and break her chains. The people were deeply moved with the complaints and groans of Zion. The Pisans, the Genoese, with Bosan, king of Arles, undertook a maritime expedition against the Saracens, and made an incursion upon the coasts of Syria. These hostilities, and the number of the pilgrims, which increased every day, might well create distrust in the masters of the East. The Saracens, alarmed by sinister predictions, and by the imprudent menaces of the Christians, saw nothing but enemies in the disciples of Christ. From that time, terror and death guarded the gates of Jerusalem. It is impossible, says William of Tyre, to describe all the species of persecutions to which the Christians were then exposed. Among the instances of barbarity cited by the historians, there is one which gave to Tasso the idea of his affecting episode of Olindus and Sophronia, One of the bitterest enemies of the Christians, in order to increase the hatred of their persecutors, threw, in the night, a dead dog into one of the principal mosques of the city. The first who repaired thither to morning prayer were seized with horror at the sight of this profanation, and proclaimed their anger aloud. Threatening clamors soon resounded in every part of the city. The crowd assembled in a state of tumultuous excitement around the mosque. The Christians were at once accused of this act of sacrilege, and all swore to wash out the outrage to their prophet in the blood of the perpetrators. All Christians were about to be immolated to the revenge of the Mussulmans, and already were they prepared for death, when a young man, whose name history has not preserved, presented himself in the midst of them. The greatest misfortune that could happen, said he, would be that the Church of Jerusalem should perish. When a people is threatened with destruction, it is just that a single man should sacrifice himself for the salvation of all. I here and now offer myself as a victim, to die for you. To you I leave the charge of doing justice to my memory, and I recommend myself to your prayers." After pronouncing these words, which dissolved the assembly in tears, he quitted them, and repaired to the chiefs of the Mussulmans. He declared himself alone to be the author of the crime imputed to the Christians, and invoked upon himself the death with which his brethren were menaced. The Mussulmans, without being in the least touched by his generous devotion, were sacrificed with the victim, who offered himself to their vengeance. The sword was no longer suspended over the heads of the Christians, and he who had immolated himself for their safety went, according to the expression of William of Tyre, to receive in heaven the reward reserved for those whose minds burn with a love of perfect charity.